it doesn't hurt to have what I'm going to call a tsar of common sense. Somebody who is not really involved with the project, somebody who doesn't fully know what this is about, somebody to whom you can toss the dashboard and say, hey, what are you getting when I'm asking you to look at this dashboard? What is it that strikes you as being important? What is it that you focus on? When you are working with the data, and you know the data, and you understand the data, what is at play are your attentive triggers, your attentive processes. Like you're really in the data. It's difficult to take that hat off and to look at the results with fresh eyes. The fresh eyes of a general audience who did not work on the data. So if you have this option, and that might mean that you need to play that role for other teams and other projects, you probably want to have somebody there who would be able to sort of be a barometer to gauge whether you're able to engage the right pre-attentive processes to focus on what it is that you want your audience to focus on. What you also need to do is to spend some time decluttering the charts. The tendency that we have as newcomers to the field is to try to put as much information as possible on our charts. Like if we can put everything on one page, we'd be like, great job, everything fit on one page. Density, clutter is your enemy. At least it's the enemy of making charts that will be easily parsed by your audience. Every time you add an element on a page, you add to the cognitive load, the brain energy required to parse the page. What you need to do is to identify anything that isn't adding value and to remove it. Now there's going to be design elements that reinforce one another, and there'll be a reason why you want both of them, three of them, four of them to be there. But in many instances, and this is perhaps where your tsar of common sense would come in handy, they're not truly adding value to the chart. Remove those. The mental effort required to process information, you want this to be as low as possible. It should not be a chore for your audience to parse your charts. If it becomes a chore, guess what? People will not parse them. They will not use your displays, your dashboards, and turn them into policies. It's just not going to happen. Various authors have different ways to describe these. Tufte talks about the data to ink ratio. The larger the share of a graphic's ink devoted to data, the better it is. And Duarte in Resonate, she calls that something else. She says that you're trying to maximize the signal to noise ratio. Signal is the information or the story you're trying to communicate, and the noise is everything that comes between the story and the audience. Now sometimes you want some of the embellishments because they help you tell the story better in a more convincing fashion. Well, that isn't really noise anymore. That's part of the signal, at least part of the vehicle that transmits the signal. You use some of the Gestalt principles to try to organize and highlight data in the chart. Look at the two charts here on your right. They represent the same time series. Which one do you prefer? The top one or the bottom one? Which one is easier for you to read? What you're trying to do to declutter your charts is to align all the elements that can be aligned. The graphs, you might have multiple graphs in your charts, they should be aligned. So the boundaries of the graphs should be, continuing one another. You have the continuation principle. You should align your text. I didn't do it here. Look at this. Things and more things are not aligned. That's a rookie mistake. These things should be aligned. Your title should be aligned. You shouldn't rely on your audience's eye to see what comes together and what doesn't come together. If possible, you remove the borders. Boxes around charts, not a good idea in general. They just create more cognitive load for no good reason. Grid lines should potentially be removed. At the very least, you should consider not having too many grid lines. Access labels should be cleaned up as well. And if possible, you might want to label the data directly. Like, this is a thing, this is more things. One thing you should consider never doing, text at an angle, bad idea. You have the option, like you can decide to have a vertical axis with numbers, or you could decide to have the specific values accompanying each of the points, but having both is sort of useless. In this example, decided to remove the actual labels and the points themselves and just keep this axis here, but I could have gone the other way around as well. I could have said, let's just clear out the vertical axis and just keep the values on the points. There's multiple ways to do this, obviously. And it does depend on what you're trying to get your audience to understand. If the message that you want the audience to understand is that, look, there's a group of people for whom more things was larger than things, and a group of other people for whom things were larger than more things, then yeah, I mean, that's all you need to have here. Do you need to know the specific numbers? I don't know. Another thing you might think of course this is meant to be a silly example, but does it make sense to have a time series, a line graph for objects that are basically just people? So now there's always going to be a bit of a danger when you declutter your charts properly, however that ends up being, and you get a chart that looks good. Well, if you use the wrong type of chart to start with, now you're making it even harder for people to realize that you're not using the right type of chart. So it's not sufficient to get rid of clutter. You also need to make sure that you're using a chart that is a reasonable chart to use for the type of thing you're trying to plot. But from a purely aesthetic perspective, even though the bottom one is not perfect, and even though there's something you can get from the top one, the bottom one is easier to parse. It is easier to look at. Here's a few other tricks that you might want to use. Your fonts should be consistent. If you're going to be using Dagny Pro for your font, use Dagny Pro everywhere. If you're using a serif font or families of serif fonts, don't suddenly show up with one entry being labeled with a sans serif font. The font sizes should be the same. Things that represent the same thing should be of the same size, of the same color, unless you're trying to highlight that this object is different. Steven has a real hard time with this. Like, if it wasn't for Power BI, forcing that on him because it's very difficult to change the font, that's not something that he would think of as naturally. I'm obsessive compulsive about these things, and I can notice when, a letter is not in the same font on a page of text. Be weary of thinking that this is not an important bit. It doesn't convey or carry information. There is no such thing as non-important bits in your charts when you're trying to communicate the insights. All of the trappings of style and aesthetics are supposed to help you convey the story. They are not afterthoughts. Text, again, should be either vertical or horizontal. And if you're going to use vertical text, keep in mind that English audiences are used to seeing vertical text on spine that reads top down, whereas French audiences would actually be used to seeing text that reads the other way. Now, you might not have known that or noticed that. That is, to me, some indication that as much as possible, you should try to avoid using text which is written vertically. And use white space, use empty space. Empty space is your friend. Let the margins breathe. In comics, this is called the gutter, the space between the boxes. A lot of cognitive processing happens between your elements. Lots of space means that you can allow your audience to breathe, to process things without being too constricted. So your margins, you shouldn't have text or visuals. Let your margins be margins. And try to avoid stretching the visuals to the edge of the page or too close to other visuals. Again, depending on your cultural tradition, that might be a less obvious one to follow. In Japanese comics, for instance, there's a lot of historical use of cells or images that bleed out to the edge of the pages, and they're meant to help you realize that you're reading it on a page, but it's part of a larger universe. You're immersed in a larger universe. This isn't really the case for data visualization. You don't want that. You want wide margins, plenty of space. Your white space act as the border. If you must use borders as separators, use horizontal separators only. Vertical separators make it difficult for people to parse, and that's based on the idea that it's easier for us to view things horizontally than vertically.